We designed AeroDinosaur as a one-stop, informative, and experience-centric channel, covering heavy piston-powered commercial prop liners that represented the state-of-the-art for the 1930s into the early 1960s, as well as military aircraft powered by variants of the same engines. In most of our videos, we also feature rare, inside and out, full audio footage of operations of the few remaining aircraft in these categories up to this day. In the future, vintage propliner contemporaries such as the Lockheed L-188 Electra may be considered as subjects for this channel. When on our channel homepage, please click on videos from the choices at the top to see the full range of our video offerings. Also, if you click on playlists on that same bar, you will find in one place our library of quality propliner and heavy piston videos from other YouTube creators. And of course, don't forget to slam the subscribe button. Hi, John Reed here, AeroDinosaur. This is part 3 in our series on the early airlines and their primary equipment. The first 2 parts focused on the Ford Trimotor, and this and part 4 focus on the DC-3. Also, much of the airline historical information presented in this part 3 was sourced from this book titled The Few, the Proud, the Bankrupt by Kim R. Wright. See Part 1 for our in-depth interview with Kim on early airline history. This book is available at Amazon.com and Rightway Marketing at MSN.com. In Part 1 of this series, you'll recall that in the early 1930s there were 4 major transcontinental airlines operating in the U.S. The East-West Airlines were United, Transcontinental Air Transport, later TWA, and American. Eastern Airlines was the North-South airline that served the population centers in the East. There were many smaller airlines vying for business as well. The federal government had the exclusive power to award airmail contracts to any airline which could make or break any one of them. However, airlines were able to manipulate their profits by lowering prices to the public to increase mail volume at the expense of the government, who was still paying high by-the-pound subsidy rates. This resulted in the airlines creating fake mail in order to profit from the high government subsidy spread. In a sort of whack-a-mole move, in April 1930, Congress passed legislation called the McNary-Waters Act that gave U.S. Postmaster General Walter Folger Brown absolute economic power over the airlines. Brown changed the mail pricing formula from weight-based to capacity-based. That is, a large but nearly empty mail plane could get the full fixed government subsidy as though the plane was full of mail, even though it wasn't. Also, bonuses were given to airlines with large multi-engine aircraft with state-of-the-art navigation equipment and instrumentation. This obviously gave the well-capitalized airlines, such as the Big Four just mentioned, a clear advantage over their small competitors with capacity-limited single-engine aircraft. The intent was to keep the big airlines in the airmail business, incentivizing them to carry passengers in order to reach the break-even point into profitability. Thus, Brown secured the survival and growth of the Big Four airlines as the foundation of the airline industry, at the expense of smaller competitors who now had artificial barriers to entry blocking them. Brown thought this as the best formula to efficiently handle the mail and foster passenger growth, best meeting the needs of the public and the country. However, the onset of the Great Depression caused public scrutiny of the big airline holding companies and the large fortunes of the airline investors from speculative stock manipulations. This led Congress to investigate through a commission led by Senator Hugo Black, who found that Walter Folger Brown colluded with the big airlines, carving up the country and divvying out the parts to his favorite Big Four. Brown was found to have awarded 20 of the 27 airmail route contracts to the Big Four, which raised collective eyebrows, igniting a knee-jerk chain reaction of government-induced events, which, as is usually the case, made things worse. This government intervention would lead to the Great Airmail Crisis of 1934. Senator Black recommended to the new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, that Roosevelt had the power to cancel all airmail contracts until things could be sorted out with the airlines. In January 1934, Roosevelt did just that and turned all airmail flying over to the Army Air Corps, essentially hollowing out the airlines. However, since the spark of the Great Depression in 1929, Congress had been underfunding the Army so that they mostly had single-engine, open-cockpit biplanes with no modern navigational aids and no experience flying the long distances that airmail operations required. Additionally, the winter of 1934 was the worst in nearly a decade. This ill-advised government interference had just morphed into an incompetent government operation, which spelled catastrophe. After 1 week, 5 Army pilots were killed and 6 were critically injured, with 8 planes destroyed. Another 17 pilots were killed between February and May. Capping off this human tragedy was that the post office was paying the Army $2.20 per mile versus only 54 cents previously paid to the commercial airlines. This caused Roosevelt to reverse his decision and to once again open up airmail bidding to the commercial airlines. The Big Four airlines would be back in action once again, but not before drastic changes. The main ones being that they would not be allowed to operate under their same identities, nor as part of holding companies. I should digress a bit to point out that Pan American, which was larger than every one of the Big Four, was minimally impacted by all this because they were a different animal, an international airline. We fully summarized Pan American in Part 1 of this series. 3 of the Big Four were part of holding companies, and holding companies would have to be eliminated. This caused the breakup of the Boeing conglomerate, which we described in Part 1. Boeing's many airlines were consolidated into one and then spun off the holding company as United Airlines, with W.A. Pat Patterson at the helm. The Aviation Corporation, or AVCO, spun off American Airways when it was renamed American Airlines, with C.R. Smith designated as its president. North American Aviation spun off Eastern Air Transport to become Eastern Airlines under the command of former World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker. TAT was not under a holding company, but was forced to change its name under the ridiculous identity rule, becoming Transcontinental and Western Air, or TWA, which later became Trans World Airlines under the same acronym. Jack Fry would be named its president, with Howard Hughes taking over the airline in subsequent years. The Big Four still wound up with most of the mail routes, but there were approximately 25 others flying some of them, but many of those smaller airlines were short-lived. From here, passenger service would grow exponentially, and mail service would still thrive, but take a back seat to it all. Patterson, Smith, Rickenbacker, and Fry, along with Pan American's Juan Trippe, would become the airline industry titans who would shape and build the airline industry into what it is today. They were instrumental in helping the aircraft manufacturers design and produce innovative, new, and larger aircraft, resulting in a flurry of airplane orders, improved navigation, and better services. These new aircraft would abandon the trimotor concept, switching to twin engines due to availability of increased horsepower and reduction of maintenance expense afforded by fewer engines. And the aircraft were designed to fly on a single engine in an emergency situation. The DC-3 concept, which started with the DC-1 before the mail crisis of 1934, came to fruition as a result of another airplane, the twin-engine Boeing 247, which was a revolutionary departure from the trimotors and would forever define future airframe design. It was an all-metal semi-monocoque design, which meant that its structural strength came from its stressed skin and its thin support ribs, not a bulky metal tube skeleton. It was the first transport with retractable gear. It carried 10 passengers and cruised at about 189 miles an hour with two 500-horsepower 9-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R1340 radials, an improvement of the same engine that was Pratt & Whitney's first. It had a range of 745 miles, about 33% greater than that of the Ford Trimotor, but the Trimotors had about 50% greater passenger capacity. Despite this single negative feature, all the airlines wanted the 247 and were ready to start dumping the very uncomfortable trimotors. United Airlines instigated the 247, and its orders tied up Boeing's production for 2 years, giving United a competitive advantage over all the other airlines. This forced TWA and the other airlines to turn to Douglas to design an alternative, and that was the even more advanced DC-1, as we'll see in a moment. Boeing got to sell its 75 247s to United, but that was it. The other airlines didn't need it anymore due to Douglas's superior design. Therefore, that 2-year backlog backfired on Boeing, so they learned the hard way that you divvy up initial production of a new aircraft among the several interested launch customers to avoid locking anyone out. The Douglas DC-1 first flew in July 1933, and only one was built for proving flights all over the world in TWA markings and with TWA doing the demonstrations. Like the 247, it was a semi-monocoque retractable gear design, only much larger. Engines were getting even more powerful by then, as the DC-1 was ultimately powered by two 710 horsepower 9-cylinder Curtiss-Wright R1820 Cyclones. The plane had 2 rows of 6 seats for a total of 12 passengers, still slightly fewer passengers than the later Ford Trimotors. It was the first passenger plane allowing passengers to stand erect in the cabin, which was not possible in the Boeing 247. Again, the DC-1 was little more than a proving aircraft, and production aircraft were improved to a point that they were designated as DC-2s. The production DC-2 had a lengthened cabin to allow for 2 rows of 7 seats for 14 passengers, which is 2 more than the DC-1, and an overall increased payload for a gross weight of up to 18,500 pounds. It had a newer, larger rudder for better directional stability and improved wheel brakes. It started with the same Wright 1820 engines as the DC-1, but most production DC-2s featured R1820s of substantially increased horsepower, totaling 875 horsepower each. The first production DC-2 rolled off the line in May 1934, and TWA started proving flights then. The plane was certificated 2 months later in June. It had a cruise speed of 190 miles an hour and a superior range of 1,000 miles compared to 750 miles for the Boeing 247. It broke a number of coast-to-coast and city pair speed records, as one would expect. The next deliveries were to Pan American and Panagra for Caribbean and South Central American services, and then to Pan Am's affiliate, China National, in Asia. Eastern Airlines and American were next, and later Western, Braniff, and Northwest, then latecomer Delta in 1940, long after the follow-on DC-3s were being delivered. Many non-U.S. airlines flew the DC-2, and a few were license-built by Fokker and others. By 1935, the DC-2 was recognized as the world's most advanced transport aircraft and was considered the first comfortable airliner for passengers. United was stuck with the inferior 247Ds that had to be consistently modified in a vain attempt to keep them up to date in the public's eye. They would never get any DC-2s, but did get into the queue for the more advanced DC-3 in a big way as the manufacturers learned not to tie up production for just one customer. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Force purchased the DC-2, as did foreign militaries. The DC-2s participated in the Spanish Civil War and World War II. A total of 192 DC-2s were built, of which 130 of them were commercial and 62 were for the military. Out of this cauldron of change came the plane that changed the world, the Douglas DC-3. It defined the airlines as they are today. The Ford Trimotor quietly exited the limelight, only to quietly survive behind the scenes for decades. After the DC-2's short reign of only about 3 years, the much improved DC-3 transport plane would remain front and center over the next decade, both commercially and militarily, and would remain quite visible for almost 6 decades beyond that. It was the first heavy piston transport to be in wide use on the 50th anniversary of its maiden flight. The DC-3 started off as the fuselage-widened Douglas Sleeper Transport, or DST, as instigated by United Airlines. It would have 7 upper and 7 lower berths, plus a private cabin area up front. But it was also found that as a pure day passenger plane, they could now fit an extra row of 7 seats for a total of 21 passengers, becoming the definitive DC-3. Therefore, only a few DST sleeper transports were built in favor of the high-capacity passenger configurations. The initial DC-3s were powered by the uprated Curtiss-Wright R1820 engines starting at 1,000 horsepower each and later reaching 1,200 horsepower each. However, starting with United's order in early 1937, most all DC-3s manufactured were fitted with 14-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R1830s, eventually reaching 1,200 horsepower each, which became the definitive power plant for the DC-3 and military C-47s. Wingspan was increased from the DC-2's 85 feet to 95 feet. Gross takeoff weight reached just over 25,000 pounds. While the DC-3 had a full fuel range of 1,245 miles with minimal payload, its economical range with a nominal load of passengers was 800 miles, reduced to 300 miles at maximum passenger capacity and full payload. American Airlines introduced DC-3 service in June 1936 on a non-stop New York to Chicago service. Most other major airlines, such as TWA, United, Eastern, Delta, Braniff, and Continental, followed suit with orders. By 1938, the DC-3 was recognized as the standard flagship equipment for the majors and dozens of non-U.S. flagged airlines. Like the DC-2, the DC-3 began breaking coast-to-coast records and specific city pair records once again. The real breakthrough of the DC-3 was economy. It was the first airliner able to break even with passengers only on many routes and no mail or government subsidies required. Just over 600 commercial DC-3s were built, and many were drafted into the U.S. and other militaries during World War II under various designations, not including the 10,000 plus military C-47s that were built and deployed. There was also an estimated 5,500 built under license with non-U.S. builders. This results in an estimated total of 16,000 airframes built, or 10 to 15 times the typical production run of a normal, successful aircraft. The C-47 was best known as the primary transport of the U.S. military during World War II, particularly in its role as a paratrooper and airdrop platform during the D-Day invasion of the Normandy coast in France, starting on June 6, 1944, and numerous other U.S. World War II and Allied operations. The C-47 achieved further recognition and visibility with its role in the 1948 Berlin airlift, of which plenty of information is available in books and online. The last C-47s rolled off the assembly lines in late World War II, and the last DC-3 was built in early 1947. Immediately after the war, DC-3s were rapidly being replaced by substantially more advanced piston aircraft in the commercial realm. The DC-3 first surrendered its long routes to the DC-4 and Constellation right after World War II. When the C-47s flooded the market post-World War II, large numbers were converted to commercial passenger and freighter variants. Handling only the short routes of the major airlines until around 1950, DC-3/C-47s were funneled into the local service airlines, including the well-known names such as Southwestern Airways, which is not today's Southwest, also Ozark, Frontier, Piedmont, Southern, North Central, Mohawk, and Pacific Airlines, among others. Then the DC-3/C-47s slowly relegated their short routes to the Martin 202/404 and Convair 240/340/440, fully supplanting both the major and local service airline routes by around 1970. However, the DC-3/C-47 maintained a major presence with small mom-and-pop freight operations, often with only one aircraft, as well as many small supplementals for at least the next 3 decades. C-47s were flown extensively with all branches of the U.S. military and reserve squadrons throughout the post-war decades into the 1970s, and even much longer with non-U.S. militaries. Because there were so many DC-3s and surplus C-47s flooding the market in the post-war years, there were many conversions performed that resulted in substantially improved performance, including the installation of technically improved high-horsepower Wright R1820 piston engines, as well as turboprop conversions. These will be touched on in Part 4 of this series and in a follow-on video. Now in our feature in this Part 3, we'll view some airshow video I took of a restored Continental Airlines DC-3 operating at Air Venture Oshkosh in 1990, and then of an airworthy post-war C-47 as flown by the United States Air Force into at least the early 1970s, plus some short clips of more recent day passenger and freighter DC-3s in operation. In our next documentary, Part 4, we'll focus almost exclusively on footage I shot at EAA Air Venture Oshkosh in 2019 of a wide variety of DC-3s and C-47s in various formations for an impressive 75th anniversary D-Day remembrance. We'll also cover a few of the many DC-3 C-47 conversions that are continuing to this day, and follow up with operational footage on the most successful turboprop conversion, the BT-67.
Looks like a dry run on that submarine. One of the favorite names for this airplane was the Goody Bird. Hey, Queen of the Sky, B-17's active into position, getting ready to roll. Followed out by a couple Corsairs and Mustangs. C-47s operated everywhere. In the China India Burma Theater, they were used to haul cargo and troops behind the line. DC-3 was first flown in 1935, and it changes airline history forever. That was the plane that made the airlines as you know them now. These were extremely useful for dropping equipment from the air because the CG was so easily upset by moving equipment around in the airplane. As long as the flew the servers to takeoff, they could move it anywhere in the plane in flight without really upsetting the balance. Howard Pardue coming in to start his aerobatic routine. B-47 just coming in for a touchdown. Looks like he's going to wheel her on. Look at that. One wheel than the other. Not a bobble. Okay, Howard Pardue going up from Breckenridge, Texas. Fine, F4U Corsair. Beautifully aerobatic routine. Howie flies all over the country with this beautifully restored Corsair. Of course, the first Corsair saw action with the Marines in Guadalcanal on February 14, 1943. It continued its service until 53 for the longest service life of any American fighter. Making that turnaround. Howie now should be setting himself up for a landing.
Lockheed Constellation will be joining us in the air, along with the other classic airplanes coming up.
Behind the front line.
Back in those days were licensed, and they did build DC-3, as did the Soviets.
Danny, this airplane actually came off the production line in 1940. And originally, wasn't
I was going to